Yeah, and as I say, Jim's wife Julie, she's such a spectacular lady, and I just feel so.
For nearly 3 decades, the world convinced itself that Kate Winslet and Leonardo DiCaprio were living out Hollywood's most tragic real-life romance. Two soulmates bound by fate, forever separated by bad timing. We watched the red carpet embraces, the tearful acceptance speeches, and the quiet glances that fueled endless speculation. But as Kate crosses a milestone 50th birthday, she has finally shattered the romantic illusion with a raw, unexpected truth about what really happens behind closed doors when the cameras stop rolling. What she revealed doesn't just reframe 28 years of Hollywood history. It exposes the one promise they made that changed everything. 50 years old. It is a milestone that forces even the most guarded celebrities to pause, look backward, and reckon with the story the world has written about them. And for Kate Winslet, no chapter of that story has been more obsessively dissected, more romantically mythologized, or more fundamentally misunderstood than her relationship with Leonardo DiCaprio. For nearly 3 decades, fans have projected an entire love story onto two people who met as teenagers on a freezing water tank in Mexico. Every red carpet embrace became a headline. Every tearful speech became proof of something deeper. Every time Leo showed up to support Kate at a premiere, or Kate flew across the Atlantic to sit front row at one of his rare public appearances, the internet erupted with the same desperate question. Why aren't they together? But here is what most people never considered. Kate Winslet has spent the majority of her adult life answering that question, and she has spent just as much time carefully avoiding the real one underneath it. Now, as she crosses into her 50s, something has shifted. The polished, rehearsed answers she used to give in her 30s, the ones about brotherhood, about family, about how Leo is like a sibling, have started to crack. In recent interviews surrounding her latest projects and her milestone birthday, Kate has begun speaking about Leonardo with a rawness that feels entirely new. She is no longer performing gratitude for the cameras. She is no longer softening her words to protect a carefully constructed narrative. Instead, she is telling the truth. And the truth, as it turns out, is far more complicated than any fairy tale Hollywood ever tried to manufacture. Kate has openly acknowledged that the pressure surrounding their dynamic was suffocating from the very beginning. She has described how, within months of Titanic's release, complete strangers felt entitled to dictate the terms of her most intimate relationship. Magazine covers demanded to know whether she and Leo were secretly dating. Talk show hosts cornered her with leading questions designed to extract a confession she never intended to make. The world decided they were star-crossed lovers long before either of them had the emotional vocabulary to understand what they actually were to each other. And this is where Kate's new candor becomes genuinely startling. She has admitted that the relentless public pressure didn't just annoy her. It actively shaped the way she and Leo navigated their bond for years. They became hyper-aware of every gesture, every phone call, every moment of physical affection that might be misinterpreted. They learned to self-censor in ways that most people in their early 20s simply should not have to. But beneath all of that external noise, Kate has now revealed that there was a specific private moment between them, something that happened when they were barely out of their teens, that drew a line in the sand. A moment so defining, so emotionally charged, that it established the unspoken rules governing their relationship for the next 28 years. She has hinted at it before, in fragments scattered across different interviews over the years. But now, at 50, she is finally willing to name it. She is finally willing to describe the exact conversation that locked their dynamic into place, and more importantly, the terrifying fragility of that agreement in the months that followed. Because the truth is, that boundary almost didn't hold. In the chaotic, overwhelming aftermath of becoming the two most famous young actors on the planet, the pact they made was tested almost immediately. And the circumstances surrounding that first test reveal something about their relationship that no fan theory has ever captured. To understand why that moment mattered so much, you have to go back to where it all started. Not to the premiere of Titanic, not to the Oscar campaigns, not to any of the public moments the world remembers. You have to go back to a sweltering, isolated film set in the summer of 1996, where two terrified kids were about to have their lives destroyed and rebuilt in the span of 7 brutal months. And it was there, in the middle of that chaos, that the real story began. Picture this. It is the summer of 1996, and you are 21 years old. You have been cast in what the studio executives are already whispering might be the most expensive disaster in Hollywood history. The budget is ballooning out of control. The director, James Cameron, is pushing everyone to the brink of physical collapse. And you are spending 12 to 14 hours a day submerged in a massive water tank in Rosarito, Mexico, shivering so violently between takes that the makeup team has to reapply your frostbite prosthetics because your real skin has started turning the same shade of blue. That was Kate Winslet's reality. And standing right next to her in that freezing water, enduring the exact same punishment, was a 22-year-old Leonardo DiCaprio. Now, it is easy to romanticize this origin story from the comfort of hindsight. We know how it ends. We know the film became a cultural earthquake. We know both of them survived to become legends. But in that moment, neither of them knew any of that. What they knew was exhaustion. What they knew was fear. And what they knew, perhaps more than anything else, was that they were the only two people on that entire sprawling set who truly understood what the other was going through. The conditions were brutal beyond anything either of them had experienced. Kate has spoken about developing pneumonia during production, about collapsing from hypothermia, about being so physically depleted that she once told Cameron she would not get back in the water unless he personally apologized to her. Leo, meanwhile, was battling his own demons, the sudden, disorienting realization that his career was about to shift from respected indie darling to global phenomenon whether he wanted it or not. He was famously resistant to the Titanic machine, skipping promotional obligations, clashing with the studio, and privately expressing terror about the loss of anonymity he could already feel closing in around him. And in the middle of all that chaos, something quietly extraordinary happened between them. It was not a grand romantic gesture. It was not a dramatic declaration under the stars. It was something far more fragile and far more real. Late one night, after a particularly grueling shoot that had left both of them emotionally shattered, Kate and Leo sat together in the humid Mexican darkness and made a promise to each other. The details of that conversation have remained fiercely private for nearly 3 decades, but Kate has confirmed its essence in recent years. They agreed, in the simplest and most honest terms two frightened young people could manage, that they would protect each other from the madness that was about to consume their lives. They would not let the industry turn them into rivals. They would not let the tabloids manufacture a narrative they did not consent to. They would not let the overwhelming gravitational pull of instant, suffocating fame destroy the one genuine human connection they had forged in the trenches. Sounds noble. It sounds almost impossibly mature for two people barely out of their teens. And that is exactly why it almost fell apart within months. Because when Titanic premiered in December of 1997 and the world detonated around them, the pressure was unlike anything either had imagined. Kate was suddenly fielding marriage proposals from strangers on every continent. Leo could not walk down a street in any major city without triggering a stampede. And in the suffocating whirlwind of press tours, award ceremonies, and relentless public scrutiny, the quiet pact they had made in Mexico began to fracture under the weight of a reality neither was prepared for. Then came the moment that tested everything. During a private gathering in the early months of 1998, away from cameras and publicists, one of them said something to the other that neither had planned. A confession so raw and so unexpected that it threatened to shatter the very boundary they had sworn to protect. And the way they chose to handle that confession in the hours that followed would determine the entire trajectory of their relationship for the next 28 years. But to understand the gravity of what happened next, you have to understand the devastating personal storms that were about to hit Kate Winslet's private life, and the role Leo would quietly step into when her world began to fall apart. The years that followed the Titanic explosion were supposed to be the golden era of Kate Winslet's life. She had the world at her feet, an Oscar nomination at 22, and a career trajectory that most actors spend lifetimes chasing. But behind the glamour, behind the magazine covers and the red carpet gowns, Kate's personal life was quietly unraveling in ways the public barely noticed. Her first marriage to director Jim Threppleton in 1998 was a whirlwind decision made in the chaotic aftermath of global superstardom. Kate was 23, overwhelmed, and desperately searching for stability in a life that had been turned upside down almost overnight. The marriage produced her daughter, Mia, but it also produced a suffocating sense of isolation that Kate has since described as one of the loneliest periods of her entire life. By 2001, it was over, and in the wreckage of that divorce, there was one phone call that Kate made before almost anyone else. She called Leo. He answered on the first ring. He always did. This is the detail that most celebrity retrospectives gloss over, but it is absolutely critical to understanding the architecture of their bond. While the tabloids were busy tracking Leo's rotating cast of supermodel girlfriends, Gisele Bündchen, Bar Raffaelli, and an endless parade of women whose names blurred together in the gossip columns, his most consistent, most emotionally intimate relationship was with a woman he was never romantically involved with. He was the person Kate called when her first marriage collapsed. He was the person she called when the press turned vicious. He was the person she called when she felt like the entire world was watching her fail and she simply could not breathe under the weight of it. And when Kate found love again with director Sam Mendes in the early 2000s, Leo did something that stunned everyone who witnessed it. He walked her down the aisle. Think about that for a moment. The man the entire world believed was her secret soulmate, the man millions of fans desperately wanted her to end up with, stood beside her in a quiet Caribbean ceremony and gave her away to another man. It was a gesture so profoundly selfless, so completely devoid of ego, that it should have silenced the romantic speculation once and for all. But of course it did not. If anything, it only deepened the mythology. Because what kind of relationship allows for that level of intimacy without crossing into romance? What kind of bond survives that kind of sacrifice without cracking? The answer, as Kate has now begun to reveal, is a bond forged in mutual survival. Leo was navigating his own private chaos, the relentless pressure to settle down, the public mockery of his dating patterns, the deep-seated fear of commitment that he has never fully explained to this day. And Kate was his anchor in that storm just as much as he was hers. They were two people who understood, on a cellular level, what it felt like to have your entire identity consumed by a single cultural moment, and they refused to let that shared trauma drive them apart. But then came the crisis that changed everything. In the late 2000s, as Kate's marriage to Sam Mendes began showing the first hairline fractures that would eventually lead to their separation in 2010, a sudden and deeply personal emergency struck Kate's family. The details remain closely guarded, but those closest to her have confirmed that it was a moment of such acute vulnerability that Kate found herself unable to maintain the careful emotional boundaries she and Leo had preserved for over a decade. Leo dropped everything. He crossed an ocean within hours. And in the days that followed, he stepped into a role in Kate's life that neither of them had ever anticipated. One that blurred the lines of their carefully constructed agreement in ways that left both of them visibly shaken. And it was precisely this emotional upheaval that set the stage for the most psychologically complex chapter of their entire story. Because just as Kate's personal world was fracturing, Sam Mendes handed both of them a script that would force them to channel every ounce of their private pain directly into their most explosive on-screen collaboration yet. And what happened on that set would leave everyone involved questioning whether the boundary between performance and reality had finally, irreversibly dissolved. There is a particular kind of cruelty in asking two people to perform the disintegration of a marriage on camera while the director calling the shots is the woman's real-life husband. And yet, that is exactly the scenario that Sam Mendes constructed when he cast Kate Winslet and Leonardo DiCaprio in Revolutionary Road, their first on-screen reunion since Titanic a full decade earlier. On paper, the project was a masterstroke. The film was an adaptation of Richard Yates's devastating novel about a suburban couple in the 1950s whose suffocating domestic life slowly crushes every dream they once shared. Frank and April Wheeler were, in many ways, the dark mirror image of Jack and Rose, two people who might have been soulmates in another life but who instead destroy each other through resentment, compromise, and the slow erosion of hope. The casting was almost too perfect. Audiences would see Jack and Rose grow old together, and it would be a nightmare. But behind the scenes, the reality was far more psychologically volatile than any press release could convey. Kate and Sam's marriage was already under enormous strain by the time cameras started rolling in 2007. The pressures of dual careers, raising two children, and navigating the relentless scrutiny of Hollywood had taken a toll that neither was willing to publicly acknowledge. And into this fragile domestic ecosystem walked Leonardo DiCaprio, Kate's closest confidant, the person who knew her better than almost anyone alive, and the man her husband now needed to direct in scenes of searing emotional intimacy opposite his own wife. The tension was immediate and palpable. Crew members on set have since described an atmosphere that felt less like a film production and more like a psychological experiment teetering on the edge of collapse. Sam was meticulous, demanding, and unflinching in his pursuit of raw emotional truth. He pushed Kate and Leo to strip away every layer of artifice, to dig into the ugliest, most uncomfortable corners of their characters' deteriorating relationship. And because Kate and Leo's real-life bond was so deep, so layered with decades of shared history, the performances they delivered were almost disturbingly authentic. The climactic argument scene between Frank and April is widely regarded as one of the most brutal marital confrontations ever committed to film. Kate screams until her voice breaks. Leo's face contorts with a rage that feels less like acting and more like exorcism. The scene is so viscerally uncomfortable that audiences frequently look away from the screen. And according to multiple accounts from the set, the take that made it into the final cut was not entirely scripted. During one of the later takes, Leo deviated from the dialogue. He said something to Kate. Something quiet, something personal. That was not in the Yates screenplay and was not in any of Sam's extensive rehearsal notes. Kate's reaction was instantaneous and completely unguarded. Her face crumbled in a way that the camera captured with devastating clarity, and for a few seconds, the entire set fell into a stunned, breathless silence. Sam Mendes reportedly called cut, but he did not immediately call for another take. Witnesses have described him standing behind the monitor, visibly unsettled, staring at the playback with an expression that suggested he had just witnessed something he was not entirely sure he was supposed to see. Whatever Leo had said to Kate in that moment had breached the wall between fiction and reality in a way that no amount of directorial control could contain. The scene stayed in the film. The marriage did not survive much longer. Kate and Sam announced their separation in early 2010, and while Revolutionary Road was never cited as a cause, the timing has always haunted those who witnessed the production firsthand. The film had demanded that Kate and Leo excavate emotions so raw and so real that the boundary between their characters and themselves had become almost impossible to locate. And it was in the aftermath of that emotional reckoning, amid the wreckage of another failed marriage and the lingering aftershocks of that unscripted moment on set, that Kate found herself sitting in the Dolby Theater years later, watching the man she loved most in the world finally receive the recognition he had been denied for decades. But what happened in the private moments immediately after that historic Oscar win would reveal a cost to their loyalty that neither of them had ever spoken about publicly. February 28, 2016. The 88th Academy Awards inside the Dolby Theater in Hollywood. If you were watching television that night, you remember the unbearable tension in the room. For over 2 decades, Leonardo DiCaprio's relationship with the Academy had become one of the most famous running jokes in pop culture history. 5 previous acting nominations, 0 wins, an entire internet subculture dedicated to memes of Leo chasing a golden statue that always seemed to slip through his fingers at the very last second. He had eaten raw bison liver. He had endured sub-zero temperatures in the Canadian wilderness. He had pushed his body to the absolute brink of hypothermia for The Revenant. Everyone in that auditorium knew this was his moment. And sitting just a few feet away from him, wearing a shimmering black Ralph Lauren gown, was Kate Winslet. Kate was nominated that night too, for Best Supporting Actress in Steve Jobs. But if you watched her on the red carpet beforehand, you would never have guessed she was in contention for an Oscar herself. When reporters stopped her to ask about her own chances, she immediately deflected. When asked about her nomination, she brushed it aside to talk about Leo. Earlier that year, when industry figures were boycotting the ceremony over diversity issues, Kate publicly explained her controversial decision to attend with disarming simplicity. "I feel very strongly that it may be Leo's year. He is my closest friend in the world, and I just couldn't imagine not being there to support him." Think about the weight of that statement. In an industry defined by cutthroat ambition, self-promotion, and relentless vanity, Kate Winslet openly deprioritized her own professional narrative to serve as a witness for someone else. Behind studio doors, industry insiders knew the truth. Kate had been Leo's fiercest, most vocal champion for years. She used her institutional respect inside the academy to actively campaign for his craft, frequently reminding voters and journalists alike of the sheer technical mastery behind his work. She didn't do it for PR. She did it because she believed, with every fiber of her being, that the world consistently took his brilliance for granted simply because he had once been a teenage heartthrob. Then came the moment. Julianne Moore walked to the podium. She opened the envelope. She paused, smiled, and said the words the entire world had been waiting 23 years to hear. Leonardo DiCaprio, The Revenant. The auditorium exploded into a standing ovation. But the broadcast director made an immediate, instinctual choice. The cameras didn't just stay on Leo as he walked to the stage. They cut straight to Kate. And what millions of viewers saw in that split second was completely unvarnished human emotion. Kate wasn't doing a polite, polished celebrity clap. Her hands were clamped tightly over her trembling mouth. Tears were streaming down her face. Her shoulders shook with a relief so intense, so profound, that it looked as though a crushing weight had just been lifted from her own chest. As Leo delivered his speech, calmly addressing climate change and thanking his collaborators, the camera returned to Kate in the front row, weeping openly, watching him with an expression of pure, unadulterated devotion. It became the defining image of the night. Yet the most telling moment didn't happen under the stage lights. It happened 30 minutes later, in a quiet, heavily guarded corridor backstage near the press room. Away from the blinding flashes of the step and repeat and the thumping bass of the governor's ball, Leo and Kate found themselves standing face to face in the hallway. Leo was clutching the heavy gold statuette. Kate had finally wiped away her tears. Witnesses nearby noted that they didn't embrace with the theatrical energy they usually performed on the red carpet. Instead, they stood together in near total silence, Leo leaning his forehead gently against hers, speaking in low, hushed tones that no microphone could catch. It was an exchange marked by an overwhelming, unspoken exhaustion, because in that quiet corridor, holding the physical proof of his ultimate professional triumph, both of them recognized the silent personal cost of their 20-year loyalty. They had carried each other through divorces, public ridicule, personal betrayals, and professional burnout. They had protected each other's secrets at the expense of their own personal lives. Neither of them knew it at the time, but that Oscar night would be the last time they would share a public stage together for years, because a global crisis was looming on the horizon, one that would separate them by oceans, trap them on opposite sides of the planet, and enforce the longest physical separation of their entire 28-year relationship. And when they finally saw each other again, the emotional dam that both had kept fortified for decades would break completely. For 24 years, no matter how chaotic their filming schedules became, Kate Winslet and Leonardo DiCaprio were never truly out of reach. If Kate was shooting an indie drama in the rain-drenched hills of England, Leo was a transatlantic flight away. If Leo was buried in an exhausting production in the Australian outback or the Canadian Rockies, Kate's voice on the end of a late-night phone call was his direct link to reality. Then the world stopped. When the pandemic brought global travel to an abrupt, terrifying halt in early 2020, it erected a barrier neither had ever anticipated. Kate found herself locked down in the English countryside, throwing herself into the emotionally draining production of Mayor of Easttown, while Leo remained insulated in Los Angeles and Boston, working through the isolated, masked shoot of Don't Look Up. Months bled into years. Closed borders, mandatory quarantines, and relentless back-to-back shooting schedules meant that, for the first time since they met as terrified 20-somethings in 1996, nearly 3 entire years passed without them breathing the same air. It was the longest physical separation of their adult lives. And when they finally reunited in Los Angeles in late 2021, the emotional dam that both had maintained for nearly 3 decades did not simply crack. It shattered. Kate spoke about that reunion shortly afterward in an extraordinarily candid interview with The Guardian, and her description of the encounter stripped away every shred of Hollywood glamour. There was no stylized, movie star restraint. There was no PR-filtered poise. When she walked into the room and saw Leo standing there in front of her, she completely collapsed. "I couldn't stop crying," Kate admitted, her voice catching as she recounted the moment to reporters. "I've known him for half my life. It's not as if I found myself in New York or he's been in London and there's been a chance to have dinner or grab a coffee and a catch-up. We haven't been able to leave our countries. Like so many friendships globally, we've missed each other because of COVID. She looked at him and was hit with the visceral, staggering realization that more than half of her existence on this planet had been inextricably linked to this one man. She had met him when she was 21. She was now 46. He had met her when he was 22. He was now 47. They had watched each other grow from fragile, insecure kids terrified of James Cameron's wrath into cinematic titans who had conquered every corner of their industry. And yet, sitting across from each other that evening at a quiet, secluded table far away from publicists, managers, and flashing cameras, the conversation shifted into territory neither had expected. The easy banter and familiar industry gossip quickly faded, replaced by an unsettling, introspective quiet. They began confronting the inescapable reality of their own mortality. They talked about the relentless speed with which time was slipping through their fingers. They talked about the exhausting toll of spending 3 decades under the microscope of fame, and the quiet sacrifices they had made in their personal lives just to survive it. Then Leo leaned across the table. According to those familiar with the quiet reflections Kate shared in the months following that dinner, Leo looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen on his face in years. He dropped the impenetrable, charismatic armor that usually shielded him from the outside world, and he asked a single, quiet question about their past, a question about the choices they had made, the emotional boundaries they had drawn, and whether the pact they forged back in Rosarito was truly designed to protect their connection, or if it had quietly prevented them from acknowledging something far deeper. That single question caught Kate completely off guard. It forced her to look back across 28 years of shared history, broken marriages, and quiet sacrifices, viewing their entire timeline through a completely different lens. And it was that very realization that laid the groundwork for the raw, definitive truth Kate Winslet is finally prepared to speak as she reaches her 50th year. Turning 50 brings a profound kind of clarity. It strips away the exhausting need to perform, to manage public expectations, or to cater to narratives manufactured by an industry obsessed with fairy tale endings. And as Kate Winslet steps into this milestone decade, she is no longer interested in letting the world reduce her bond with Leonardo DiCaprio to a simple will-they-won't-they tragedy. Because the ultimate truth Kate has arrived at, the truth she has finally articulated with absolute, unwavering certainty, is that the world's romantic fantasy completely misses the point. For 28 years, fans lamented that Kate and Leo never became a real-life couple. People looked at their undeniable chemistry, their shared history, and their deep mutual reverence, viewing their platonic status as a missed opportunity, a sad compromise forced by bad timing and parallel lives. But Kate now views it from the exact opposite perspective. To her, crossing that romantic threshold would not have been the fulfillment of their story. It would have been its destruction. When Leo asked her that quiet, vulnerable question across the table in Los Angeles, wondering if their strict boundaries had been an act of protection or an act of fear, Kate had time to reflect on every triumph and tragedy they had navigated since 1996. And the answer she found was both simple and staggering. Hollywood is a graveyard of passionate romances. Celebrity marriages ignite under intense spotlight pressure and inevitably burn to ashes within years, leaving behind bitter divorces, custody battles, and irreparable silence. Kate lived through that heartbreak multiple times. Leo watched it happen from the sidelines of his own transient relationships. If they had given in to the overwhelming romantic gravity that surrounded them in their early 20s, their relationship almost certainly would have suffered the exact same fate. It would have been intense, it would have been cinematic, and it would have ended. Instead, they made a conscious, radical choice. And that brings us back to the private memory from the freezing waters of Rosarito that Kate kept guarded for nearly 3 decades. Late one night on the Titanic set, shivering in a trailer while the production ground to a halt around them, the electricity between them was undeniable. They were young, beautiful, and sharing an experience no one else on Earth could comprehend. In that moment, falling into each other would have been the easiest, most natural thing in the world. Yet, as Kate has now softly acknowledged, they looked at each other's terror, recognized the fragile brilliance of what they had just found, and made an unspoken pact. They chose to sacrifice a temporary romance to secure a permanent sanctuary. They decided that having a lifelong anchor in an industry designed to tear people apart was infinitely more valuable than a fleeting love affair that would burn out before they turned 30. At 50 years old, Kate Winslet does not look at Leonardo DiCaprio as the one that got away. She looks at him as the only one who stayed. He was there before the world knew her name. He was there through 3 marriages, 2 divorces, and the births of her children. He was there to hold her hand in the dark when the cameras stopped flashing, and she was there to weep tears of pure joy when he finally stood at the summit of their industry. Their bond isn't a Hollywood tragedy. It is the rarest triumph the entertainment world has ever produced. A 28-year testament to unconditional devotion, radical emotional honesty, and a loyalty that outlasted fame, distance, and time itself. They didn't give up on love. They simply invented a version of it strong enough to survive the real world. What was the private realization Leo shared during their emotional reunion that made Kate rethink the foundation of their 28-year bond? And what is the one secret from 1996 that she finally chose to confess at 50?